Nahum is difficult stuff. I said this the last time I was up here. It's not so much being thrown into a pond of cold water. It's more like being thrown into an active volcano. Nahum does not pull any punches. He gets right to the point. But with that being said, I think there are some things that we need to keep in mind when we read through Nahum and when we read through what Nahum has to say, because I think that they will help us with overcoming some of maybe our biases toward the book and toward the Old Testament as a whole. The first of which I direct you to is the very last verse we left off on in our study of the book of Jonah. Matt read Jonah chapter 4 for us this morning as part of our scripture reading. The very last verse of Jonah is that kind of cliffhanger of the book, if you recall. We don't get an answer to God's question to Jonah. We don't know what happens next. What we do get is God's sentiment towards Nineveh. And the final sentiment of Jonah chapter 4 in Jonah 4:11 is, "Should I not care about the great city of Nineveh, which has more than 120,000 people?" And the answer to that question is, of course God should care about them. Each of those people is God's creation, his workmanship made in his image. And the idea of that question is, yes, I should care about those people. But we also might think about other passages. You know, when we're looking at the Old Testament and we're seeing the God's wrath passages, the sinners in the hand of an angry God, there are things that we have to keep in mind. Things like, for instance, Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 32. "For I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the sovereign Lord. So repent and live." You know, we look at the Old Testament and we say, well, God's just punishing people right and left. I mean, you go from the flood narrative to Sodom and Gomorrah to God punishing his own people in the wilderness, so on and so forth. Just one angry judgment passage after another one. And then you get to the prophets, and it's a whole new ball game. It's not just things that God is doing, it's things that he's going to do, and there's fire and hail and earthquakes and all those things. And granted, all of those things are present in Nahum chapter 1 in the very first part of the chapter. And yet, I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the Lord. Repent and live. Or maybe, how about one that might be a little bit closer in proximity to us? One that we covered in our recent study of 1st and 2nd Peter. Matt did a great job with that, and I'd invite you to go back and look at that. But the very last thing that Peter has to say in those letters, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Not wanting who to perish? Anyone at all. The Lord's plan for every single one of us and every single one of the people of Assyria in this time is for them to repent and to live. And he has been patient with them to do that. Jonah is a prime number 1A example of that. But 100 years have passed, and things aren't getting any better. They've regressed back into cruelty and oppression and self-will and all of those things that we see in numerous other places with numerous other nations. They are Babel. We talked about that last time. They are Babel. They're built on violence and oppression and trying to be like God. And so God has to take action, and we'll talk about that. But remember, just like Ezekiel 18, I take no pleasure, 2 Peter chapter 3, not wanting anyone to perish. But there has to be a time when that comes to bear. And so what Peter tells us is the day of the Lord will come. Will come. And we talked a little bit last time about the day of the Lord, the concept of the day of the Lord, and how there's not just one great day of the Lord, as we might think. You know, we read Revelation, and we think there's this one event that all of the mentions of the day of the Lord in the Bible are pointing to. Now, granted, they do foreshadow that great day of the Lord, but there are many days of the Lord. And one is coming for Assyria, and in particular, Nineveh in this case. And so that is where Nahum is going to pick up. But as we read through Nahum, and we read about the vengeance of the Lord, the wrath of the Lord, and all of these terms that we have to come to grips with, remember, I take no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the sovereign Lord. Keep that in mind in the forefront. And that goes right back to what we've talked about in Jonah and what I told you to think about all through the prophets. Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. The Lord is compassionate. The Lord is merciful, and he is patient. Okay? Keep those things in mind as we go through this. All right, so let's start talking about the book itself. What's the point of Nahum? How many people have read through Nahum? Please tell me everybody's read through Nahum. I see a sparse few hands. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. What's Nahum doing? What is Nahum? In terms of the grand scheme of things, what is Nahum? We're covering the minor. He's a prophet. He's a prophet. What's a prophet do? Yes, they prophesy, but what do? They speak on behalf of the Lord. That's right. Exactly right. Now, that can be judgment. That can be, they could proclaim freedom. They can proclaim freedom in the face of judgment. And that's what I think Nahum is going to do for us here. So when we look at Nahum and what Nahum has to say, remember, Nahum is speaking on God's behalf. We should not read this book as if Nahum is expressing his own viewpoint and only that. Okay? Nahum is not just invoking God's wrath. We think of that maybe similar to the imprecatory Psalms. Lord, remember my enemies and cast them down and those types of things. We are seeing in Nahum the divine perspective carried down to man. Nahum is just the mouthpiece. But it's the divine perspective carried down to man against an oppressive nation that has set itself above all others, that has practiced cruelty and treated God's mercy with contempt. They are the Babel of their day. They are the Egypt of their day. They are simply one of a series of empires that has tried to place itself in God's place. And they've treated God's mercy with contempt, as we saw in the book of Jonah. This book is most likely, as we talked about last time, written during Ashurbanipal's reign. It is one of the cruelest reigns in all of Assyria. There are a number of inscriptions and reliefs that describe Ashurbanipal's, Sennacherib's, all of these kings, all of their reigns and the cruelty that they not only inflicted on people, but boasted about inflicting on people. Horrible, horrible things, not the least of which are impalements and beheadings and stacking up the corpses of their victims and rivers of blood, all these types of things. They brag about these things. They are not just a violent culture, they are a culture that revels in violence. And that's how they expand their reign. Now, again, we look at the Old Testament and we might think, well, that's how God expands his kingdom. No. Assyria does not care whether people die on their path to power. God does. God does. Okay? So this is kind of the purpose of Nahum then. He's speaking on God's behalf to a nation that has set itself above all others. The book itself, if you've read through it, it's abrupt, right? It features kind of short, kind of staccato, like very quick, rapid succession imagery with language that's really meant to overwhelm your senses. When you read this book, you're meant to be taken aback at the descriptions of it. Nahum's not the only one that does that. Amos hits pretty hard. Obadiah hits pretty hard, among others. But you're meant to be overwhelmed by what you're seeing here. The structure and the language are meant to make one feel the words playing out and to give a sense of urgency and really chaos in Nineveh's destruction. Because that's what God is doing in judgment. Remember, God, on behalf of his people, he separates in order to organize. That's what he does for Israel. That's how he creates the nation of Israel out in the wilderness, right? He brings them out into the wilderness. He gives them structure and order. He separates them into tribes and does all these things, and he creates a nation of order. When God destroys a nation, though, we see chaos. That's what happens. And God is showing both that nation and through that nation what the end result of no God is. And so that's what he's doing. And so, you go through the book and the language is almost taunting in some cases. But what that does is it underlines the superiority of God. And we're going to see that here in chapter 1. I'm just going to give you a preview. We're only going to get through the first 8 verses of chapter 1 tonight. But there's a lot there. So bear with me, okay? And then we will speed up as the book goes on because much of the book is kind of along the same line of thought. But the very first part of Nahum chapter 1 is establishing something for us here. And it's something that is a greater whole that we're going to see in all the prophets, right? So Nahum in his book is going to use some allusions to prominent Assyrian symbols to create a sense of poetic justice, actually. So, for example, in chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, he mentions lions. He'll say, where is the lion's lair or the feeding ground of the young lions, where the lion and lioness prowled and the lion's cub with nothing to frighten them away? The Assyrian kings hunted lions for sport to show their superiority. Okay, we think of lions being the king of the beasts, right? Well, they hunt lions in order to show they are superior. When we went to Ethiopia, we went to the Capitol building in Addis Ababa, the home of Haile Selassie, who was Ethiopia's greatest emperor in the 20th century. There was a not a statue. It was a what am I looking for? A taxidermied lion, a full lion that had been hunted and killed by the royalty of Ethiopia to show their superiority. Okay, and it's on display in that palace. So, Nahum is going to use allusions like that, where is the lion? And he's going to use those kind of Assyrian symbols in order to show a sense of poetic justice. All right, let's pick up here. Chapter 1 and verse 1. We've kind of danced around the book this whole time. Let's get straight into it. The oracle concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. All right, now stop. I told you, a lot here. All right, now mine says oracle. Any other verbiage out there? What else is used instead of the word oracle? What's that? Prophecy? The burden. Okay, I want to come back to that one. Anybody else? Pronouncement or proclamation. Yes. All right, so all of these I think are very apt language, but I want to come back to burden. Burden, I think, is a good one. Yes, it is an oracle. What's an oracle, by the way? We see that in Old and New Testament. What's an oracle? A wise or authoritative statement. Okay, all right, but isn't a proverb a wise and authoritative statement? Yes. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, what else? What makes something an oracle? A declaration. Okay, yeah. What else? A declaration of whom? Okay. Okay. But isn't it interesting, though, that we do think of it in sense of doom. A burden, yes. And I want to come back to that one in just one second. Okay. But the word oracle is just an interesting one because we even see that in the New Testament, right? We are to speak as the oracles of God. Now, does that mean that we as Christians are supposed to speak doom to everyone? What does that mean? How do we speak as oracles of God? What does that word mean? Okay, so there are consequences to not heeding that word. That's true. That's true. Mouthpieces for God. Okay, so now we're getting back to the sense of being a prophet. We are to speak to people just as the prophets spoke to people. We don't hold back. And an oracle is something, yes, it is something speaking on behalf of something bigger, right? It is an oracle. Omen has such mystical terms to it, but it has great portent or importance. And so oracle, or I think I heard pronouncement. So you think an oracle is something that's being proclaimed out. Okay. Now I want to get back to this term burden. I like this term because the word here is the word massa, M-A-S-S-A. It's the same word that's used in Numbers chapter 4 to describe the duties of the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites. Now, I'm sure everybody remembers what the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites did because you all remember my study of Leviticus and Numbers that we did last year. Okay, so everybody tell me what the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites did.
They carried the utensils of the tabernacle and the tabernacle itself.
Okay, I think Eddie's cheating, but that's fine. He already knew all that. But if you remember, when we studied the book of Numbers, yes, the Kohathites, the Merarites, and the Gershonites were tasked with carrying the implements of the temple. And so when you go to Numbers chapter 4 and you read about their duties being outlined, it says that it is their task or their burden, their masa. Okay, so they carry the things of importance for the tabernacle, which is what? What is the tabernacle? Okay, it's the resting place of God, the dwelling place of God in the midst of his people, right? So when you see the Gershonites, the Merarites, and the Kohathites coming, what's coming? The Lord is coming. When you see these groups of people bearing their burden, I mean, that's exactly what the word is. You know that the Lord is about to be in the midst of his people. Now we know the Lord's presence is always with us. But when you see them coming and they set up their implements, the Lord is about to be directly in their presence in a very real sense. And so I just think it's interesting that word is the exact same word. You know, we might look at oracle and we kind of give it this very kind of sense. You know, it's this word that's bigger than us that we don't use every day. I mean, do you in everyday conversation use the word oracle? No, you don't. I can't even think of a sense in which I would use that word. But burden, however, and not burden in a bad sense, because the Kohathites, the Merarites, and the Gershonites, it was a blessing to those groups to be able to carry that burden. So, Nahum's words then, if we're going to use that language, Nahum's words are heavy. I'll put that in quotes, heavy words. Why are they heavy words? Why would they refer to this as a burden? We have such negative connotations for that word, but why would this be a burden? Okay, it carries strong consequences. I think that's very good. Yeah. First of all, the fact that this is a message of doom. I mean, we kind of said that a second ago. And so it's going to have very heavy implications. That's true. Okay, why else? Okay, yeah, again, that goes back to the consequences. If God speaks and tells you to do something, or he imparts mercy to you, then it's a very serious thing for you to disregard that. And therefore, it can be burdensome for you. Yeah. How about in terms of Nahum? Why would this be a burden for him? Okay, with great power comes great responsibility. I mean, the great Stan Lee once philosophized about that, didn't he? I don't know if he wrote that line or not, but it's a great one. With great power comes great responsibility. And so Nahum has been given a serious responsibility, just like Jonah did, just like Jonah was. But Nahum leans into it. And so this is a burden for Nineveh in the fact that he's got to carry the word of the Lord. How did Moses feel about carrying the word of the Lord, by the way? Lord, I don't want to do this. Can you get somebody else to do this for me? And so the Lord gave him Aaron, and he did those things. And so carrying the word of the Lord, especially a word of judgment, is not an easy task. How about us? Do you want to go down to Courthouse Square in downtown Lexington with the message of judgment and just start yelling it out to everybody? Would that be a burden to you? You don't have to lie. It would be for me. I mean, for sure. You know? Okay, so it's a burden. How about one other aspect, maybe, one that we might not have thought of? How about the fact that this is a burden for the Lord? You ever think about that? We already said the Lord takes no pleasure in the death of anyone, and he doesn't want anyone to perish. I think really what we see in Nahum and the prophets at large, especially in passages of judgment, is we're seeing God's anguish. We're seeing God's anguish over the depravity and the cruelty of man. That's what we're seeing, and that's why this is a burden. Not only is Nahum tasked with proclaiming judgment and an ill fate to Nineveh, he is tasked with expressing the Lord's displeasure and the Lord's sorrow over man's activity. That's a heavy burden. I mean, if one of you asked me to come and, express your sorrow or your anger to another person, it would be difficult for me. You've got the Lord's displeasure that you're tasked with expressing. And so, I think that word burden, in the sense of carrying something of weight, something that's heavy and has great importance, is very apt. I don't think proclamation or oracle is an unfit word. I don't think that at all. We see this same word used in various other places, particularly in the book of Isaiah, as Isaiah is calling down judgment against the nations on the Lord's behalf. And so this same word will be used, the burden of the Lord, concerning Edom and concerning Babylon and concerning Egypt and all these various nations that have oppressed Israel. It's the same exact word. Okay, so let's go to the second half of this then, the book of the vision. These words are so heavy and of such importance that not only is Nahum tasked with giving them, but he's also told to write them down, or we can at least imply that he's told to write them down. Can you think of someone else who was told to write down words of a vision? How's that? John. John is the first thing that comes to mind for me, right? So you think of, for instance, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 11. Son of man, write down these words. Write down everything that you see, and then we have the whole book of Revelation as a result. Well, what is the book of Revelation but an oracle of God about a great day of the Lord that is coming, presumably, and for that one, against Rome. But we know from the text that, again, that's a type of Babel or Babylon, and the one who endures will be rewarded by the Lord and will be with him. That's what we're seeing in the prophets of the Old Testament. The prophecy that Nahum records, indeed any prophecy that's recorded, is recorded for posterity and as a testament that God will do as he promised. He will act against evil and he will care for those who seek him and will persevere. We have Nahum in order to show us that God said a thing was going to happen. And then we have historical precedent to see that thing happened. The word of the Lord came to pass. And so when he says, I'm going to punish a nation, I'm going to bring judgment on a nation for their activity, we can also have hope of what for those who persevere? Of deliverance. Okay, so it's a two-sided coin there. And we have that recorded for us. Now, one other thing about this verse, and then we'll move on, or we can go into commentary if you like. The word Nahum itself, the name Nahum. Nahum means, anybody have a guess or anybody know? It means comfort. Yes, comfort or consolation. Yeah, that's kind of a stark contrast for what we see in the book of Nahum. It's not a very comforting book for Assyria, but who would it be comforting for? It would be comforting for Israel, and there's particularly for Judah, but yes, Israel. Okay, so it's interesting. How about the word Elkosh? Nahum is an Elkoshite. How about the word Elkosh? Well, whenever you see the word El in the Bible, what is that? That's God. Okay, so now we got to figure out what the other part of that is. Well, Kosh is from the root word trap or snare. So it is God, the ensnarer, the trapper. Now, who's being trapped in the book of Nahum? All right. So again, right here in the very first verse, I know, Mike said he doesn't want to get into vocabulary in his class and those types of things, but it's very interesting. You got to admit, when you look at some of these words and you see meaning, names were of great meaning in Hebrew society. And so when we look at names, it's okay for us to ponder what might that name mean and how might it be relevant to what we're reading. And so Nahum, the comforter, is proclaiming to Assyria about God, the ensnarer, God who is pulling Assyria into a trap, and I'll say a trap of their own making. We don't have any other historical information about Nahum or about Elkosh. Elkosh, there's much speculation about where it is. Some say it's in Assyria, close to Nineveh. Some say it's in Judah. Some say that Capernaum, which, interesting fact, what does Capernaum mean? Capernaum. Capernaum, it means city of Nahum. That's interesting. So that could very well be where Nahum is from. I don't know, but there's your fun fact for the day. That's a freebie. But we don't have any other historical info on Nahum or Elkosh. The only thing we might possibly have is, first of all, this is before the destruction of Nineveh. Some people believe that this book was written afterwards. I don't know. But in chapter 3 and verse 8, we do see a reference to the fall of Thebes, which we talked about last time. Thebes was one of the major cities in Egypt. And so that helps us to kind of place this in a proper context, in that it would be after that, but before the fall of Assyria. So sometime in that time frame. And so we've put this somewhere in the time of Manasseh, late Manasseh, or Ammon, or Josiah's reign. So this would be very late Judah. Any comments or questions on verse 1? Hey, lot there. We'll move a little faster, I promise. But I think it's of interest. Okay, so I told you we're only going to go through verse 8 tonight, and I'm going to spare you, and then we'll pick up in verse 9 next time and let that drive us for the rest of the book. But Nahum chapter 1 and verse 2, I'm going to read through this whole section here. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is fierce in wrath. The Lord takes vengeance against his foes. He is furious with his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will never leave the guilty unpunished. His path is in the whirlwind and storm, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet. He rebukes the sea so that it dries up, and he makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, even the flower of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his burning anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. Even rocks are shattered before him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of distress. He cares for those who take refuge in him, but he will completely destroy Nineveh with an overwhelming flood, and he will chase his enemies into darkness. You can almost hear the boom, kind of the doom sound, right? All right, so let's kind of parse some of this out. The reason I wanted to cover this is it's kind of set apart from the rest of the book. It's relevant to the rest of the book, but when we read through the prophets, one other thing to keep an eye out for is poetry. How many of you in your Bibles, this is how this is written down or typed is a little bit differently from normal narrative? Everybody kind of got that in their Bibles? Yeah, so you see it's written down in lines, and sometimes those lines aren't always broken up the way that we would. It's written more like a song or a poem. And that's because Hebrew poetry is very important. It's a common way to express things in Hebrew writings, and in particular prophecy. You know, we saw the Song of Moses written that way in Exodus chapter 15. We see when Joshua is standing before the people as they're about to cross into the promised land. Some of his final words are written in this very same way. We see the Psalms basically written out this way. And so prophetic language is no different. It's Hebrew poetry and prose written out for us. Now, in their case, a lot of times it would have been written out in a particular structure. In this case, chapter 1, verses 2 through 8 form a broken acrostic, which means each of the first lines, or a word in the first lines, has a word of the Hebrew alphabet in it in order. Now, they're not all there. I said it's broken. But what that could mean is that it's potentially written, it could be written from an existing Hebrew psalm or hymn or poem, and Nahum co-opted that for his prophecy. And so he's using something familiar to them in order to express something else. And we're going to see that. We're going to see some things that hopefully are familiar to us. You know, although the book is written against Nineveh, there may be a reason to believe it's written to Judah as well. So, for instance, look at verses 2 and 3. I wrote down the wrong verses. Verses 2 and 3. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. Okay, well, where do we see that concept in Scripture? Anybody think of a place earlier in Scripture where we might have seen that? Where do we see the Lord as a jealous God? Exodus chapter 20, 10 commandments, right? One of the commandments is you shall not make any graven images, for the Lord your God is a jealous God. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 5. That particular sentiment is repeated again to the next generation in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as they're standing on the edge of the promised land. That first generation who originally heard the commandments died out. And now the second generation is hearing that same thing. Moses expresses that again. Deuteronomy chapter 6, you shall not make any graven images, for the Lord your God is a jealous God and an avenging God. And he will remember the sins of the children to the second and third generations. Or how about the next part of that? The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. Now, if you don't remember where this came from, you're going to be in trouble with the teacher. Where does this come from? The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power.
Slow to anger with
He is from Nineveh. Okay, yes. So Jonah, yes. All right. I'm thinking kind of maybe original context, but that's a good point. Exodus chapter 34. We talked about that, right? Exodus chapter 34. This is how God describes himself after what event? Moses' request because of what happens in Exodus 33? The golden calf. The golden calf. In the face of sin, this is how God describes himself. And so they're familiar with these. And we see it again, Numbers chapter 14 and verse 18. God says the exact same thing as he's giving the law. Numbers 14, particularly Numbers 14, is another event, an infamous event in Israel's history, which is the unwillingness to go into the promised land. Isn't it interesting that in both of those cases, two of the worst moments of Israel's early history, and one that will be used to define Israel for generations to come in a negative context, the golden calf and the refusal to go into the promised land. God in both instances underlines the Lord is slow to anger. Slow to anger. So again, remember, keep these things in mind when we're reading these things. Now,
it's interesting that slow to anger comes right after fierce and wrath, with no sense of irony. Because sometimes we get this idea that if you're slow to anger, you don't get angry.
right.
But that Nahum doesn't, there's no conflict here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Nahum would not put these two ideas right next to each other. God is slow to anger, but he can still get very, very angry.
Yeah, yes, he can. Have you ever known somebody that is just steady? I mean, that they are just a calm, gentle person. Not necessarily that they're weak. Maybe it's somebody that you might look up to as being a person that has great fortitude. They are a wise person, one that's worth looking up to, or a mentor. But you know they are not a person that is easily angered. I mean, really, that's what elders are supposed to be, right? But they are a person that is not easily angered. Now, when you see that person get angry, what does that tell you? There's a real reason. That's right. There's a big problem. Okay? And so when you see somebody that is normally very calm, very in control, and not to say that when that person gets angry that they are out of control, because that's definitely not what we see with God. But when that person is angry or upset, you know that there is a significant thing happening. Okay, so that's the sense that we need to get with God's wrath. And Mike is very astute there to say that, yeah, that slowness of wrath is contrasted. And that's what we see here as well. He is slow to anger, but verse 3, he is great in power. All right. So I want to talk about some of these words just very quickly, because a lot of these words, I think, are some of the ones that we use or we might hear that give such negative connotation to God. All right. So first of all, the word jealous. Well, jealous or avenging or full of wrath. What comes to mind when you hear these words? Or let me rephrase this question. Who in the Old Testament comes to mind when you hear these words? Let me just say them. Who do you think of in the Old Testament in terms of characters when you hear the word jealousy? Okay, Cain, jealous of Abel. Anybody else? I think I heard, what did I hear? Saul, okay. Who's that? Ahab was jealous of Naboth's vineyard. Yes, he wanted a thing that he could not have. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Okay, jealous of Joseph, right? Among other things. But yeah, all right. Now, the one that came to mind most prominently for me was Saul. I think that's a very good one. Saul being jealous of David and his accomplishments. And there was no need for that. But this was a jealousy that got out of control, right? I mean, Saul sought to kill David and put him on the run and pursued him constantly, right? How about vengeful? What about somebody who expresses vengeance in the Old Testament? Or revenge, I guess is a better way to put that. Okay, you could go with Saul, someone trying to get revenge, yeah. I think two of the ones that Dempsey mentioned came to mind for me. How about Simeon and Judah? Remember when their sister was defiled? What did they do? Now, they were very calculated about it. Who did I say? I said Judah. I'm sorry. Simeon and Levi. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me. Simeon and Levi. Yeah. Okay. They wanted revenge for their sister. How about someone that's full of wrath or anger? We mentioned this guy last time, I think. We've already mentioned him here. Who's the first person where we see the word fury? Cain. Okay. Cain went into a rage and killed Abel. All right. How about, let's flip the coin now. It's very easy, I think, for us to think of the negative people that come to mind with these particular words: jealousy, vengeance, wrath. How about positive aspects of these words? Any examples come to mind of jealousy? Okay, jealous, or maybe what's another word that rhymes with it? Zealous. Zealous, okay, because that's what zeal is. It is godly jealousy. So David, a very good example. Anybody else? How about Joshua and Caleb? They had a godly jealousy or a zeal for the Lord. Okay, we could probably think of some other examples. How about vengeance or avenging? Not the Avengers, but someone who acts as an avenger or expresses the sentiments of an avenger. Oh, very good. Yes. Yes. What was his name? Why do I forget his name every single time? Phineas. Thank you. I always want to say Eliphaz, but that's not it. It's Phineas. Phineas. Okay, very good. Yeah. That's a great example, okay, of zeal and of avenging. There was a plague. How about, to use your example from a second ago, how about David? Yes, we definitely see that sentiment in the Psalms some, but remember David's final words to Saul? What are they? Yes, he expresses to Saul, grow in the wisdom of the Lord and seek him and his face, but David's final, did I say Saul? I meant Solomon. David's final words to Solomon are what? Seek out Joab. Okay? What did Joab do? He killed Abner. What else did he do? What's that? Asahel, yes. Joab's hands were drenched in blood, not just for the fact that he was David's general, but he was an ungodly general. He had grudges and he acted on impulse. Was Joab also the one that killed Absalom? I believe so, right? Yeah. So some of David's final words to Saul are seek justice against Joab. Now, those things had taken place a long time ago, but David still had a sense of justice that he wanted his son to carry out. Okay, how about wrath? Or let's put it this way, anger. Who expresses anger in the Old Testament? I think there's a very big example. Maybe go back to Exodus 33. Moses, right? You got the tablets inscribed by the literal finger of God. And what does he do with them? He gets mad and chucks them down, says, you're not worthy of these things, right? He is angry. The God that brought you out of Egypt, you have betrayed, and he is angry at them, okay? So yes, we can look at these characteristics in a very negative sense. We can think of the Sauls and the Ahabs and the Cains and all of those bad examples, but also think of these in the context that they need to be kept in. God is not a man that these aspects are corruptible to him. That's how we tend to look at the God of the Old Testament, though. We say, why would he do this? Why would he be this way? Well, he is perfect. So these aspects have to be a part of that perfection, is what I'm getting to. So just looking at these three words, first of all, the word jealous. How can jealousy be a good thing in our lives? Just kind of think about your lives. I see a lot of parents out here. Are you jealous for your child's attention? especially when they're on that iPad for 4 hours a day and you need them to clean their room or you need them to get ready to go somewhere? Are you jealous for their attention? Yes. How about, are you jealous for their attention when you're walking down the street and there's traffic nearby and you're telling them, stay right next to me because I don't want you out in that. You could get hurt. I am jealous for my children's attention. So jealousy is God's strong feeling and desire on behalf of his people to seek their good. How about avenging? Avenging is, how many times is vengeance mentioned in just verse 2? 3 times. 3 times in verse 2 alone, we have the word vengeance or avenging. Now, again, kind of thinking about this in terms of David talking to Solomon, this is not petty revenge. That's not what David was trying to say to Solomon as far as Joab was concerned, among others. He was saying justice needs to be done. It needs to be carried out, not carry out my grudge against this person. That's not what David was getting at the end of his life. And so, when God avenges, he's acting against evil. We like avenging in the movies. Again, I mentioned the Avengers, but we like movies where the good guys kind of get the drop on the bad guys, right? Especially when the bad guys have done something particularly bad. We like movies about World War II when the Allied powers defeat the Axis powers. We love that because we like seeing evil defeated. But in real life, in really real world terms, a lot of times we have a difficult time with vengeance. I had some examples here. For the sake of time, we're not going to go through these, but there's hope, I think. We've already mentioned this. There's hope in knowing that God is paying attention to oppression and injustice and that he will one day act. And that's what the prophecies are all about. And I'll say this, and you're welcome to disagree with me on this, but I think that this is true. You cannot have an ultimately loving God without having an ultimately just God. Would you say that that's true? Think about it. Would you?
Even God's vengeance is often on behalf of those that are faithful to him. The very first example of God taking vengeance I can think of is when he punishes Cain.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts by saying, the blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground. I'm not just doing this because you've offended me.
Mm-hmm.
Your dead brother is crying out for this justice. I'm punishing you on behalf of him.
Very good point. Very good point. Yeah. The blood of the saints cries out to the Lord. That's right. Yeah. You cannot have an ultimately loving God without an ultimately just God. All right. I mean, you just think about, you watch the news at night and you hear about these awful stories of people doing things and you say, I wish somebody would do something about that. And God says, I am one day going to do something about that. And so we can read in Romans, vengeance is whose? It's mine. Vengeance is mine. Okay, now that's going to take us directly to the next one. So full of wrath. And this, I think, is one of the ones that we have the hardest time with because we think God is just angry all the time, that he's just got this fiery countenance and he's ready to strike down upon enemies and friends alike if they cross his path the wrong way. Okay, literally, this is the word Yubal Chama. Now, you hear Yubal, Baal. Baal means Lord. It's where the term for the idol comes from. Baal, Yubal Chama. The Lord is a master of wrath or a possessor, an owner of fury. And so when you think about it in that terms, we think of it as being full of wrath, as if he's a tea kettle that's now just screaming, and maybe that's kind of what's happening in terms, but that he's just this constant tea kettle that's just ready to erupt at any moment. No, he is the Lord, the owner of fury. And that's why in Romans, he can say, vengeance is mine. It belongs to me because I am the Lord of it. I have possession of vengeance. And we know that when the Lord possesses something like that, he doesn't misuse it like we do. The Lord is not a man. He will not misuse what belongs to him. And so think of it in that way. He is the Lord of wrath. Yes.
A lot of times, what we do, as you mentioned earlier, it's like a personifying God.
Mhm.
What happens with people is that fury often possesses them.
Yes.
But this is a very clear point. God is in possession of his.
That's right.
And that is the big difference.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. You know, we assign that attribute, as Eddie just said, we assign that attribute as if God were an abusive man, right? That you just don't know when you're going to step wrong of him. But did God give his people a clear law? The law was a merciful thing. It was not a burden. And that's what he says. However, we also see the timeliness of God's anger. He is slow to anger. And again, that goes back to Exodus chapter 34. That's that Eric Apayim that we talked about, the longness of nose, right? That he is not quick to let his fury boil over. And he is great in power. Now, the next portion of this poem, and this is how we're going to wrap up tonight, the next portion of this poem is the largest part, and it bears witness to God's power. Now, I'd invite you to look at this and look at it with these words highlighted. What's happening here? His path is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet. He rebukes the sea and it dries up, and he makes all the rivers run dry, so on and so forth. Whirlwind, storm, dust, dries up, runs dry, withers, quakes, melts, trembles, shatter. The idea here is that creation is reflecting the anguish of the Creator. Can you think of another event where creation reflects the anguish of the event? The flood. How about another one, maybe more New Testament example? The crucifixion. Yeah. Nature is responding to God's anger and sadness. That's what's happening here. And so we see those images in Hebrew prophecy. That's really what's happening. Can you think of another time when God was associated with a whirlwind? Elijah. How about another one? Twice with Elijah, yes. How about maybe where the Lord speaks from a whirlwind? Job chapter 38, right? The Lord spoke to Job from the whirlwind. That's right. Now, what does the Lord speak to Job from the whirlwind? You don't have to give me every detail, but what's he doing? He's expressing his power. His power in relation to what or who? To man, and in particular, that man is Job, right? Can you imagine being Job sitting there? All right, I think of this as a series of can you questions. Can you do this? Can you do that? Were you there? Were you the one who established that? And what is the only answer Job can give? That would be no answer, because the answer is no. I can't do those things, and I don't know how they were done. Only you know, Lord. And so that's the answer to Job's quandary is, there are things happening here that you don't understand. Your job is not to understand them. Your job is to remain faithful. Now, that seems harsh in the case of Job. I'm not going to go into Job's case right now. But you think about God's place in relation to his creation. He is the creator. When you watch the weather, particularly in the months of August and September, what's something we see ravaging a lot of times? The Gulf Coast. Hurricanes, vast storms. Or when we have a storm front that, a cold front that meets a very warm front. A lot of times we have the spinoff of tornadoes and things like that across the Midwest. Okay? God controls all of those things. And we can see that in very real fashion. Mark chapter 4 and verse 39. Do we see Jesus controlling anything? Peace, be still. Can you do that? No. Okay, or how about what we read this morning, Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Everything was created through him and for him. All right, now he's going to do the same thing for Nineveh, though. He's going to direct that. He mentions, we don't have time for this. He mentions Bashan and Carmel and Lebanon. I would invite you to look sometime at Isaiah chapter 33. Those specific places are also mentioned in that place in the same context, and they precede a period of judgment against the nations. But another thing that they precede in direct proximity, only 3 chapters later, is Sennacherib's invasion of Judah. Okay? So when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, by the way, comes down and invades Judah, what happens? In brief, what happens? God responds. He acts on behalf of his people. And so then, when we look at the very next verse in Nahum, then, we've seen the power of God. Now, when it acts on behalf of his people, how do we see it characterized? The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of distress. He cares for those who take refuge in him. So yes, God is slow to anger, and he will reach a point where that anger comes to fruition. And he will express all of the powers at his disposal in order to carry out his will, good or bad. The question is, where am I falling? Am I the one that is placing myself against him, my self-will and what I want? Or am I placing myself in his care, trusting in him as a stronghold in the day of distress, and taking refuge in him and seeking his care? I would invite you at some point, I write down Psalm chapter 9. Psalm chapter 9, these very same thoughts are ascribed to God there as well. As a matter of fact, it's almost a direct quote. Nahum may be quoting Psalm chapter 9 in that instance. But in Psalm chapter 9, notice God's protection is associated with his justice. You cannot have an ultimately loving God without an ultimately just God. And there he is called a righteous judge and a stronghold for the oppressed. But, very last verse tonight, Nahum 1:8, but he will completely destroy Nineveh with an overwhelming flood, and he will chase his enemies into darkness. And so you got that creation imagery again. You got that Genesis 6 imagery again, an overwhelming flood. And we've said that that term has been associated with the day of the Lord before, right? An overwhelming flood is a picture of judgment. And so, you think about kind of whirlwinds and storms. You think about kind of the destructive power of nature. That's kind of what's being used here to describe God's fury. Whirlwinds and storms are oblivious to those that they affect. You got a hurricane that comes through, it doesn't know. It's not actively seeking out your house to destroy it or a city to destroy it. It just does because it's got that much power and that much fury. However, again, storms, nature, creation are all under God's purview. So he can direct that hurricane, that whirlwind, that flood, all of those things at his discretion. And his discretion, his eye, right now is firmly fixed on Nineveh. Now, do you want to be Nineveh in that case? Having a God that's been described in this way with that much power and have his eye of wrath fixed firmly on you, a target on you. That's what's happening to Nineveh. This is a very scary place to be.
The very last place, he's living in darkness.
Mm-hmm.
All the way back to Genesis chapter.
Genesis, very good. Okay.
Let there be no light.
It is chaos, right? God created order when he created things, and it is a de-evolution into chaos. Very good. I hadn't thought about that. That's a very good point. Take you back to right back to Genesis chapter 1, darkness. Okay. I liken this. I'll leave it on kind of a humorous note. You ever see the movie Jurassic Park? You remember when everything just very first starts going wrong with the park and the dinosaurs get loose? Spoiler alert if you haven't seen a 30-year-old movie. And the dinosaurs get loose. And you've got those people that are in the Jeeps in the darkness and the rain. Do you remember that scene where one of the things is upside down because the T-Rex has been messing with it? And the kid has the big flashlight and he shines it out of the window. And there's that shot where you see the window and all of a sudden you see the T-Rex's eyeball right there in the window. And those people at that moment know that T-Rex's attention is directly on them. And you as a viewer now know stuff's about to go down. They either need to get out and get right, or they're going to be subject to that T-Rex, right? Now, I'll let you watch the movie if you don't know what happens yet. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger. But that's the image that comes to mind when he says, the Lord is a stronghold in the day of distress, but he will completely destroy Nineveh. His target is right in the smack dab center of Assyrian power. And when he acts, we know from history, they will not survive. Nineveh as a city was obliterated. It is a city that until recently, until the early 1900s, was not discovered. It was thought to be completely lost to history. Now, some guy stumbled upon it one day and he said, oh, this looks like it might be something. And it turned out to be Nineveh. This is the greatest city, the New York City of the Assyrian Empire, and it is nothing. That's God's discretion in Nahum. All right, I'm going to leave you there, cliffhanger. We're going to come back, and if we don't get to the whole book next time, we're going to probably go through a very large chunk of it, because the rest of the book is the description of how this is going to take place, but it's also messages interspersed with messages of comfort for Judah. And so I want to see those things. So read through the rest of the book, the end of chapter 1, and then chapters 2 and 3, and we will pick up there next time. Any closing thoughts or questions or anything like that? All right. We went a little long tonight. Thanks for bearing with me. In truth, we did get started late, so I'm going to hold on to that. But I thank you for bearing with me tonight. Let me shut this down.